Hello. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is should the franchise, which is a posh word for voting and voting rights, be expanded and widened? I'm going to argue that it should. And in particular, we're going to be looking at votes for 16, which the government have recently announced they're going to allow 16 and 17s to vote at the next election. Very controversially, we look at prisoners and whether they should be able to vote, or some prisoners anyway. And then finally have a look at, are there any other barriers to voting which should be removed? And I would argue, yes, there are, and they should be removed. So, firstly, 16-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds. The main argument made against allowing this group to vote is the fact that they're not mature. You often hear this argument to say 16 and 17-year-olds are not mature, they don't know what to do, they're going to be unduly influenced by, left-wing teachers and what their parents say. I think it's a bit of a weak argument because we don't give a maturity test to 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, and I would argue there's some quite immature 18 and 19-year-olds, and also you might say 40-year-olds. There's also very mature 16 and 17-year-olds. So we don't give a maturity test for other age groups, so I don't really see why we should do it for 16-year-olds either. The other argument you often hear against giving it to 16 and 17-year-olds is this idea that they're not fully adults. When they lowered the voting age in 1968 to allow 18-year-olds to vote, the argument was, well, this is a natural transition from childhood into adulthood. At 18, you can get married without permission from your parents. 18-year-olds can be at the front line of the armed forces. 16-year-olds need permission to get married, and they can't be on the front line of the armed forces. Again, it has some merit, I suppose, this argument. But I would say just being able to join the armed forces is a pretty mature thing to do. The fact you can pay taxes at 16, this idea that taxation equals representation, I think is a really important argument, which they don't always discuss. The third argument here to say no, don't give it to 16-year-olds is the fact they won't vote. 18 to 24-year-olds vote in the lowest number in the UK. If you look at all the voting stats, it's this age group which has the least amount of voters. Why would 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds be any different? So the argument goes, 18-year-olds don't vote, why would 16-year-olds vote? We're just going to widen the pool, if you like, of non-voters. So these are some of the arguments you often hear to say don't give it to these, lower the vote to 16. However, I think the better argument and the stronger argument is actually no. 16-year-olds should be given the right to vote, and I think there's a number of reasons for it. Firstly, this thing about not voting in large numbers, well, yeah, 18 to 24-year-olds don't vote in huge numbers, but that's not to say that 16 and 17-year-olds will follow the same trend. These groups are just emerging from school, or possibly in sixth forms or colleges still. They may well be learning, or education might change how to actually deal with things like citizenship, which might allow these groups greater knowledge of politics. I would also argue that politicians, I think, if 16-year-olds can vote, will give much greater attention to issues affecting young people. Today, because it's mainly older people who vote, governments often very keen to promote issues that help older people, like triple lot pensions and not taxing the wealthy and all this sorts of stuff. If you gave the vote to 16-year-olds, would they put up tuition fees quite so easily or so readily? Would they not perhaps give some more money towards issues which affect younger people and younger people's concerns? So I think actually by giving it to 16-year-olds, it would actually force politicians to address younger people's issues. Another argument in favour is this idea that actually they might actually vote. If you engage young people, they do actually vote. So 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds can already vote in some parts of the UK. So again, why not at Westminster? So they could vote in the Scottish independence referendum back in 2014. Large numbers of this group did vote in that election. I would say that's a really important election. It's about the breakup or otherwise of the UK. They can vote in the Scottish Parliament elections and also the Welsh Senedd elections as well. So, and the world hasn't ended in Wales and Scotland as far as I'm aware, because they've allowed 16-year-olds to vote. So it does seem a little bit contradictory that a 16-year-old can vote for the Scottish Parliament but not for a representative at Westminster in London. So it seems to me that this group already participated, and therefore it should be encouraged. So these are some of the arguments in favour of giving the vote to 16, which I personally think is the strongest argument. You might disagree. But there are some of the arguments for and against 16-year-olds. Perhaps more controversially is this idea of allowing some prisoners the right to vote. Now, notice I'm not saying all prisoners, and, this idea that some prisoners should be able to vote. The arguments against allowing some prisoners to vote are probably quite easy to think about. This idea that, well, you've committed a crime, you've damaged society in some way, you've acted against other groups, therefore you shouldn't be able to vote. It's a right and a freedom. It's an honour almost to vote, and actually by committing a crime against society, that's part of your punishment. You shouldn't be able to vote, which I think is quite a compelling, quite an emotional argument, isn't it? Basically, the counterpoint to this, though, are things like, well, actually, you don't take away everyone's freedom. Well, you do take away freedom, don't you? Everyone's liberties if they're prisoners. Still got the right to eat and heat and all the rest of it. So why should they be denied the right to vote? If you've got only short time left on your sentence, let's say you're in your final 6 months, or you've just got a very short prison sentence, a 12-month sentence perhaps, not for a major kind of crime, should that vote be taken away from you? Obviously, you're going to have to integrate back into society at some point. You could also pass, at least that 16-year-old voting point, this idea that prisoners are of really poor conditions in the UK. Some of the worst prisons in the developed country are in the UK, overcrowding, poor conditions, etc., etc. Would this situation be allowed to happen if prisoners actually voted? Because they'd actually be voting for those politicians who are actually determining, the quality, if you like, of their prisons. So it might actually help to improve the conditions of prisons. Now, you might think, well, we don't deserve it, but that is the argument which goes. So then, of course, the European Convention of Human Rights, or the court who's involved in this, nothing to do with the EU, by the way, has said that some prisoners should vote in the UK, and actually some do. In 2020, this is new to me, I didn't realise this, but in Scotland in 2020, I think it was, the Scottish Parliament allowed some prisoners who got sentences of 12 months or less the right to vote. So people who are in prison for quite petty kind of crimes, 12-month sentences or less, are able to vote. I think the turnout's been really low amongst this group. Although I suppose I've had COVID and things in the meantime. It'd be interesting to see at the next election for Scottish Parliament, which is in 2026, whether there is a substantial prisoner voting in Scotland. So there's some of the arguments for and against prisoners. And then the final area to have a look at is what about existing barriers to voting, things which are preventing people from voting at the moment, and should they be removed? Now, perhaps the most obvious barrier to voting is the voter ID laws. So the last Conservative government introduced voter ID laws because they claimed that voter fraud was an issue, because people could go to the polling station, just say who they were and vote. However, evidence seems to suggest that this isn't really true. There's not a great deal of voter fraud or evidence for it in the UK before this law was passed. And one of the issues of voter ID is that large numbers of people have found it more difficult to vote. It's another barrier to stopping people to vote, in particular poorer people who might not have the relevant ID. There's also a little bit of an ageist issue as well, because for old people or older people, they could use the over 65 free bus passes and stuff. I think they could use Oyster cards as well, over 65s. Yet younger people were not allowed to use those forms of ID. So there's a bit of a discrepancy in that, you think it'll all be at least the same type of ID. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was a former Conservative cabinet minister, he actually did say, he let it out the bag a little bit, saying they were hoping that fewer Labour people would go and vote. So that might have been the real motive behind voter ID laws. Either way, there is some evidence that has prevented some people from voting, not huge numbers, but some people from voting. In 2024, at the general election, 4% of non-voters, people who didn't vote, said they didn't vote because of lack of ID. Now, you might say, well, perhaps that was just an excuse not to vote, but that was a reason that was given. 1 in 1,200 voters in that election were actually turned away from the polling station. Again, not huge numbers, but given the fact quite a few seats have got quite small majorities, a handful of people not voting could have an impact on the results. So one argument is that we should get rid of these barriers. We should allow more people the right to vote, take away things which are stopping people to vote. Some suggestions have been things like, having greater online voting. I think it's Estonia which allows online voting. And looking at the stats for Estonia, in 2015, about 31% of Estonians voted online. Again, with the changes of technology, it is possible, isn't it, that you could see something like that in the UK. People could choose to vote online or in person, or various authenticators and passwords and stuff could be used. It might be a potential way of stopping a barrier to voting. You can vote anywhere, basically. If you're on a work or whatever, you can actually go and vote. Anyway, so these are some of the arguments for widening the franchise. So they should get rid of barriers to voting, allow 16-year-olds the right to vote, and also allow some prisoners the right to vote. Again, there's both sides of the argument. In an essay, you'd have to have a much clearer line. Do you think yes or no on these things, and why is one view better than the other? But they're just some of the arguments for and against widening the franchise.